Part 9, the duality of the imagination. Corresponding qualities of character and imagination tend to beget and reinforce each other. For example, a person caught up in selfish pleasure seeking develops a related imaginative sensibility. The hedonist is predisposed to be responsive to works of poetry and other imagination which are carried by a similar sense of life's possibilities. As the person's imagination entertains new visions of hedonistic thrills, the underlying will finds satisfaction in them and is confirmed in its orientation. Moments of aesthetical enjoyment tend to call forth corresponding efforts to realize contemplated possibilities. Such transition to practical action is never automatic. Man is free to reject even powerful appeals of desire. But over time, the interaction of an imagination and practical will in the individual creates a predisposition to be drawn into action by particular intuitions. The will that proceeds to practice belongs to the same character that finds certain visions appealing. A person of more ethical, aristocratic character has a corresponding sense of what brings genuine satisfaction. Such a person, too, may be enticed by visions of hedonistic enjoyment, especially if they are rendered with great poetic power and refinement. Imagination of this kind can play and expand upon a person's moments of flight from aristocratic ways. But because of the predominant character of this individual, hedonistic visions are likely also to create unease. Experienced as they are by an ethically more developed and sensitive personality, they are felt to be the expression of an ignoble state of soul. It is here appropriate to relate Babbitt's notion of higher will as an intercheck to the imaginative articulation of will. An individual who is drawn into some enchanting intuition or into practical action consonant with it is suddenly stopped by a sense of threat to moral good. His ethical self breaks into consciousness by arresting a present intuition or incipient action. The inner check affords the individual an opportunity to redirect his imagination and will. The purely negative act of moral censure creates room for the higher will to articulate itself in imagination. In the ethically sensitive person, the imagination may call to mind the ultimate misery of moral irresponsibility as the defeat of happiness. At best, the new intuition discredits the previously dominant lower imagination and disarms the will and sustains it. That disarms the will that sustains it. So the battle in the cave. For a person whose imagination is attuned to and is continually reinforcing a selfish disposition, the dominance of the lower will is not easily broken. In someone of generally good character who is nevertheless susceptible to the stirrings of the lower will, the imagination can become a powerful ally of more or less secret drives that the individual would not indulge in his better moments. A well-endowed imagination can fashion the potentialities of the lower self in vibrant, enthralling visions. It is able to paint even diabolical drives in alluring images. It can also help the individual suppress or conceal his moral qualms. Feelings of shame about self-indulgent behavior become portrayed, for example, as symptoms of ridiculous and narrow-minded bourgeois puritanism. Let me back this up, because if you haven't grasped the concept here, we're really talking about reinforcement of habits, and that the habits of mind that happen for the savage is that he's constantly being reinforced. Yeah, go for it. Yes, go ahead and gratify your lowest base desires. Whereas the person that has developed the habit of the inner check, that higher will, they naturally develop the habits that allow them to combat the lower desires that are always there. So a well-endowed imagination can fashion the potentialities of the lower self in vibrant, enthralling visions. It is able to paint even diabolical drives in alluring images. It can also help the individual suppress or conceal his moral qualms. Feelings of shame about self-indulgent behavior become portrayed, for example, as symptoms of ridiculous and narrow-minded bourgeois puritanism, whereas the dominant egotistical desire is depicted as manifesting a high and noble freedom above such petty notions of responsibility. Were it not for the ability of man's lower self to express itself in aesthetically appealing fashion, that self would have little power to influence people of culture. The more creative the imagination, the greater its power for good or evil. In most people, the interplay of will and imagination does not often result in intuitions of a very poetic type. The imagination usually works in brief spurts, and in the service of pressing practical needs. In a poetically inclined and gifted person, on the other hand, the imagination is sometimes detached from practical aims. It can swell into elaborate and finally harmonized visions of life. In art, intuition gives expression to possibilities of human experience according to aesthetic needs of beauty. It must not be overlooked, however, that even in the aesthetic intensification of art, imagination is at the same time will. It emanates from an underlying disposition of character. A work of art is the expression of a personality whose sense of reality is the result of innumerable acts of will in the past. These have led the artist to explore some possibilities of experience and neglect many others. The orientation of character and sensibility that has been built up over the years now selects the materials for aesthetic creation. By virtue of past willing and imagination, the artist is particularly sensitive to some potentialities of existence, less sensitive to others. We know the will of the artist by its fruits in imagination. Babbitt insists that although art must have Brutus. Babbitt insists that although art must have a special aesthetic integrity and coherence to truly be art, what is poetically expressed can differ greatly in value. Art can be more or less profound or truthful in its statement of life's possibilities. Truthful not in an intellectual cognitive sense, but in an intuitive sense. Art ranges from works which capture with depth and fullness the essence of human existence, with its anchor in moral reality, to works that are trivial and superficial, or that present positively distorting visions. Some richly poetic works disfigure or exclude central elements of life. For instance, man sometimes craves refuge from everything uncomfortable and mundane. He allows himself to be intoxicated by the imagination. He loses himself in das Fabelhaft. Intuitions that might disturb the escapist vision are kept out of poetic synthesis. The will at the root of the creation excludes what is not pleasing to it. Though works of art may contain more or less of this ingredient, most of them reflect at least some such more or less deliberate contraction and distortion of life, betraying the bias of the will that created them. Truly great art is open to the full range of possible human experience, including its more painful and disturbing parts. Its chief but not sole characteristic, Babbitt believes, is depth of ethical vision. The will of the artist must permit the contemplation of the real terms of human life, stripped of pleasing illusion. The artist's character must be such as to be familiar with the will that makes for happiness, and to enable him, from his vantage point, to intuit the influences that either help or thwart this power in the world. Without awareness of the ethical core of human existence, poetical vision will lack proportion and balance, as well as comprehensiveness. A person who is used to looking for the meaning of existence in passing pleasure of some kind, idyllic revelry, eroticism, or exercises of power, etc., will tend to express in art possibilities of experience that are consonant with the sense of what life has to offer. Should such an individual also have intuitions of a moral responsibility and allow them to enter the poetic vision, he is likely to render them according to his accustomed sensibilities, hence in a form distorted by cynicism, irony, or the like. The work of art will not convey man's actual moral predicament. To the extent that the poem does not present wholly illusory vision, it will offer flawed and fragmentary intuition. But it is possible that a hedonistically inclined poet permits a sudden intuition of ethical good to expand and deepen, so that the intuition comes into its own, and perhaps the imagination recovers long suppressed moral qualms or memories of moral struggle, and starts to view them as what they are. Such a development assumes that a new quality of will has asserted itself, one that is hospitable to a new quality of imagination. The person's aesthetic vision is transformed. A differing sense of what life may contain begins to arrange the intuitive material. Only an imagination that is sensitive to the possibilities of experience in their relation to what is ultimately real can express the essence of the human condition. Obviously, this does not mean that all people of good character can also create and appreciate art. It does mean that a powerful imagination can achieve aesthetic visions of the highest kind only if it is attuned to the real ethical opportunities and dangers of existence.